Only Pat, sir.
I knew that. I was just pulling his chain. I don't do enough.
So Pat actually hired Richard Graham, and so he knows quite a bit about Richard. And I'm not sure which years you were the wing commander, but I'm going to just hand it off onto you and give yourself introduction and your background in aviation. And
yeah, I'd be happy to. I'm glad I tuned in tonight and had a chance to fill in for Rich. I was hoping to listen to him give his talk. I've heard his talks before. He's very well organized, and he really covers the whole thing from start to finish. He does a good job on it. And like I said before, almost all of the SR pilots, after they left the Air Force, they wound up putting together PowerPoint briefings, for wherever they were living, the Chamber of Commerce or any aviation group and stuff. So they all got into the PowerPoint briefing business, as did I. I've been giving briefings off and on for 20 years. But yeah, well, I was born in Minnesota, down in a little place called Chatfield, just outside of Rochester, born on a farm down there. I went to school up in Minneapolis to the McPhail Conservatory of Music. I was going to be a musician after I left high school. And the Korean War suddenly popped up, and so I went to a recruiter. I was going to join the Army. I didn't know any different because both of my older brothers were Army guys. They were in World War II. And I wound up talking to an Air Force recruiter, and he convinced me to forget about the Army, come on in, join the Air Force, and you got enough college to go into pilot training. And he said, that's a hell of a lot better than carrying a gun in that Korean War. So I went through pilot training. I graduated in 1950, and I graduated as a fighter pilot. I was flying F-84s. In those days, the two primary airplanes, fighters in the Air Force, were the F-84 and the F-86. There were others, but those are the two primary ones. So I went through training, and then the Korean War was on, so I went over there and flew 100 combat missions in the F-84. When I came back to the States, I was again with the F-84. This time I got to fly the swept wing version 84F, which is a much higher performance airplane. I wish we'd have had that in Korea. But about that time, I got drift of a new top secret program that was being worked on, and lots of rumors are going around about it. And my wing commander called me in one day. I was a captain, I guess. He called me in and said, Strategic Air Command is going to open up this brand new program for high altitude reconnaissance. And I've been tapped to see if I can get about 4 or 5 guys from my wing. Every wing commander had the same task. That would like to go into this program. I can't tell you much of anything about it, except that it's going to be a single engine airplane. I said, that's good. And there's just one guy in it, you. And I said, that's even better. And it's going to go really, really high. It's going to be the highest airplane in the inventory. And you're going to have to wear space suits and all that stuff. And I thought, shit, I'm going to be an astronaut. It turned out, no, it was the U-2. The U-2 was just coming into the inventory of the Air Force, and SAC down in Omaha. They owned all the airplanes. We trained in Del Rio, Texas, and then we started flying overseas missions. God, we had detachments all over the world. So I flew the U-2 for 9 years. I was about the oldest experienced guy in the program. And then we got wind that there was another new program coming on. You could hear rumbles about another top secret program, and turned out it was the SR-71. And so our commander in the U-2 program at that time, he had been selected to be the new first wing commander of the SR-71s. That was going to be up at Beale Air Force Base in California, just outside of Sacramento. So when he went to take his job, he made sure that he brought 8 of us along with him. And so we were in the cadre for the SR-71. We got there before the airplane was even delivered. I was standing in a ramp when the first Blackbird came in with company test pilots. God, I couldn't believe what the hell I was seeing. I said, geez, I'm not sure I want to fly that thing. That looks like a real monster. But I was the second crew member to check out in our unit. And I found it really a delightful airplane to fly. It was just as honest, like a lot of other stuff that Lockheed makes, and Kelly Johnson in particular makes, because he was the master design guy for Lockheed. You know, he designed back in World War II the P-38, and he designed the F-80, the first operational jet that we had in America. 104, F-94, T-33, all of those things were Kelly Johnson airplanes. So he put his heart and soul in this one. He said this is the most difficult but rewarding airplane he'd ever built, was the SR-71. He had one of the hardest parts about it is because of the speed performance, they wanted to go over Mach 3 times the speed of sound as a cruising speed. And the skin temperatures at those speeds from friction is so high that none of the existing aluminum combinations and stuff that most airplanes are built out of, you couldn't build them with that material. The airplane had turned to jelly on you. So he decided to build the whole airplane out of titanium, and they'd never built an airplane out of titanium. Some of the fighters and engine people use titanium for small high temperature components, maybe within engine compartments and some of the compressor blades, but nobody had ever thought about building an airplane. And he said that's the only way it can be built because of the temperatures involved. And titanium was lighter than steel. You can't build an airplane out of steel, it'd be too heavy. So titanium is lighter and stronger. So they had to develop technologies as to just how in the hell to do that. We don't have much titanium in America, so the biggest producer of titanium was the Soviet Union, and so they formed several dummy companies. So we bought all of the titanium that's built the SR-71 out of Soviet supplies of titanium, which they were not aware of course. We got our first airplane in January of 1966. That's the day I saw the first one come in. And the first one that they delivered was a 2-seat pilot trainer. Now the SR-71 is a 2-seat airplane, but the backseater is a navigator. But they built 2 of them as pilot trainers with full flight controls in the back seat. And they elevated the back seat so that there was you're about 2 feet above the canopy for the guy in front of you. That way the pilot, the instructor, can not only fly the airplane, but he can see. And you'll notice if you ever see the airplanes, if there's an elevated back seat, that's because that's the trainer. We had 2 of those, and they built 30 what we call the A models, so the operational airplanes. Now the trainer could go just as fast and as high as the operational airplane. So that made the trainer really very practical. We had very extensive ground school. You'd spend months in the ground school. We had a very, very nice simulator. I had never been in a simulator. We didn't have those in fighters, and the U-2 didn't have a simulator. And there weren't many of those around back in the early 60s. So I was pleased to have a simulator to work with. And we had 100 hours in the simulator before you could fly the airplane. And you're going to fly with one guy, your backseater. You're never going to fly with any other backseater. We had crew integrity. He would train in the simulator. There was one cockpit for me and one for him. So we would do all of our training together. And then when it came to fly as a crew, that's who I flew with. That was the same way all of the crews. You never switched crews. Now for the training, flight training part of it, we took that two-seat trainer, and we had two instructor pilots that came out of the B-58 Hustler program. They had both been years and years of training command, and they were instructors in B-47s, instructors in B-58. There are two really highly qualified as instructors. They had gone down to Edwards Air Force Base and kind of did a checkout by themselves. They just kind of learned them how to fly the airplane, because Edwards had a couple of them just for testing before we got ours. So those guys showed up as instructors, and we would take 5 rides in the two-seat trainer. The 5th ride being a stand-board check flight. So you train for 4 flights with one instructor, and then when it came time for a check flight, the other instructor would give you the check flight. So after you finish those 5 flights and passed your check flight, then you would move over to the A model, the operational airplane. And at that point, your navigator, backseater, they were called Reconnaissance Systems Officer, RSO. So then he would fly with you, and for the first time you would fly as a crew, but you'd already had 5 flights. And he also had a couple of rides that they would let him ride with another experienced instructor pilot somehow to get up, just so he'd get up and down and figure out how to wear the spacesuit and stuff. And then we'd go off and we would fly as a crew for training, and we would have to have 100 hours in the airplane before we could go overseas to one of our operational detachments. Our first operational site was over in Okinawa, Japan, at Kadena Air Force Base. And we moved into that site in 1968. And from there, for the next 21 or 22 years, we flew operational missions over Vietnam, over North Korea, and the peripheral flights all around China and Russia. We never were allowed to do overfly Russia or China, although there were some occasions when that happened really accidentally. But after Gary Powers got shut down, you know, President Eisenhower told Khrushchev, okay, we won't overfly anymore. That's the end of those overflight programs. And so they pretty well stuck to that. And we thought when the SR was built and we got to fly it, that's what we were going to get to do, because we could overfly Russia and China with impunity. They had no weapons that could touch us. But we were limited, unfortunately, to cover Vietnam, and then we had some missions that flew down way across the Indian Ocean, south of India, and up into the Persian Gulf. We'd fly halfway around the world and then go up and fly missions over Afghanistan and places like that, and then come back clear across the Indian Ocean. Those are about 11.5-hour missions. So we flew a lot of different places, but unfortunately we never got to really hit the big boys over Russia, because that's what we thought we were going to be doing. After a couple of years, we opened a second detachment in England, another second permanent detachment. And by that time, we had a pretty good sized crew force. We had those 30 airplanes. We lost a couple, but we still had plenty of airplanes. And we had probably 35 pilots, I guess, something like that. So with those 2 detachments, now we could pretty well cover the whole world from England and Mildenhall. So that was some great flying. They used to fly all up around the northern Soviet Union. The Russian submarine pins are up there. We had cameras and side-looking radar systems and a tremendous amount of electronic gathering systems, ELINT, they called it. We could pick up, because of the altitude, we could go 300 miles into the country and be taking photographs and radar returns. And we could pick up electronic intelligence up as far as 300 to 400 miles, everything from phone calls to radar signals. And so we flew those missions frequently, and down across the Middle East, flew missions way down there. We pretty well covered everything. Flying the airplane was really a delight. Kelly did a hell of a good job on that. It's big, coming out of fighters. I felt like it was a pretty big airplane, but you can adjust to it pretty quickly. And we take off. Let's see, our takeoff speed was 210 knots, about 190. You'd start coming back on the stick a little bit, lift the nose up, and it would fly itself off the ground at about 210. And we had to be careful on that because the tire failure speed was 230 knots. So you had to be sure you didn't overshoot that and rotate it, because we'd had tire failures. In fact, we lost several airplanes with tire failures. It's tough to say that a damn tire failure would cost you an airplane, but we lost several of them with that. You pull the gear up and accelerate up to about 400 knots and start your climb at 400 knots. We took off after some of those incidents about tire failures. We decided to download the airplane a little. We took off with about half a load of fuel the rest of the whole time we flew the airplane. And we had a whole squadron of KC-135 tankers assigned just to us. They were on our airfield. They belonged to me when I was the commander. And because they had all special plumbing, special communications equipment, special rendezvous equipment. And of course, they carried our special fuel. We were the only ones that had the fuel that we had. We were the only airplane that burned it. It was special because of the high temperatures involved in the fuel tanks, that this stuff was very thermally stable, is the term they use. You could throw a match in a can of fuel and the match would go out. So there's no problem in the fire hazard. But we would take off with half a load, and then we'd take off and just level off at 25,000 feet. We'd have the tanker downstream somewhere, depending on where you're headed, a couple of 100 miles downstream. And we'd just cruise down there at 400 knots or so, and rendezvous with the tanker, and then get a full load. It takes about 15 minutes to fill up the whole airplane. And we might have two tankers at one spot, because sometimes if the mission was important, we wanted to be sure that if there was a malfunction with one tanker, we had another one that we could top off. So in those cases, we would take half a load off one tanker and then move over and take a half load off the other one, just to spread the experience out. Then after you left the tanker, we'd move off to the side, and then we'd light the afterburner. Two big, powerful afterburners. Those engines had 34,000 pounds of thrust each. So you had a hell of a lot of power at your hands. And we'd climb slowly up to about 30,000 feet, and then we'd push into a shallow dive. And the test pilots figured that out, that was the easiest way to go supersonic. If you tried to climb through Mach 1, there's a hell of a drag penalty going through initially going through Mach 1. So they devised a system where you just push over, you just go full afterburner into a shallow dive, and you pop right through Mach 1, and it's just as easy as can be. There's absolutely no delay in getting through there. And then you resume your climb at about 450 knots. And you just hold that all the way up on your climb. As you get up to about 60,000 feet, you can start slowing the climb down a little bit. And you just monitor, you trade off indicated airspeed and Mach number. And your target is what Mach number you want to cruise at. Usually we'd cruise at about 2.8 Mach number. I don't know what that is, maybe 1900 miles an hour, until you got to the area of interest that you were going to do the reconnaissance version. And then you'd push it up to Mach 3.2. That's a little over 2,000 miles an hour. And so you'd use that speed and the altitude it gives you. You'd be up over 80,000 feet. And the airplane would just cruise, it was a delightful machine. And so we do most of the work over the United Territory at 3.2. Now, temperature buildup on the airplane is very extreme, and the faster you're going, the hotter it gets. And we have some temperatures around the airplane that are just unbelievably high temperatures. And the cockpit, the canopy and everything has a very, very high temperature. The cockpit has great air conditioning, so you can handle that okay, but you put your hand on the canopy glass and you won't leave it there more than about 2 seconds, because the outside of the airplane, including the laminated glass that they have designed specially, it's about an inch thick on the canopy and the windshield. That thing just gets hotter than hell. When you finish the operational part of the mission, you get ready to descend, you have to be very careful on the descent to take care of the engine, because that engine has really been stressed from a temperature standpoint. So you have to be very careful on your descent and what your power settings are. It's a very gradual descent. If we're going to descend to hit another tanker, which normally we would do in Vietnam, there'd be a couple of tankers waiting for us in Thailand. So you'd start your descent about 200 miles out. So you can see it was a gradual descent, but you're still going like hell. And we'd go subsonic, maybe about 30,000 feet. We'd pop into subsonic flight. And we could, with our special rendezvous equipment, we could contact the tanker as much as 300 miles out to be sure he's in place and he's all set and the weather's good. And then we could range between us. They knew how far out we were and we knew how far out he was. It's just like having a TACAN. And we'd slow down to his speed. We'd usually refuel about, as I recall, it was about 30,000 feet was the normal thing, depending upon how the weather was to go through. We'd slide up underneath him. The refueling door is behind us, behind the second crew member. So I'm way forward under the belly of the tanker. And like all tankers, they have position lights on the bottom of the tanker. They're telling you if you're too close, too far forward, too high, or too low. So you had to play those lights like a pinball machine. And once the boom operator felt you were in the right proper position, you'd have a couple of green lights up there. That's where he wanted you. And then he would just extend the boom and latch in, and we'd start transferring fuel. We'd probably take maybe 15 or maybe 20 minutes. If we're really low on fuel at this point, which we usually were, then we'd top off the tanks and then pull off to the side. And normally under the Vietnam missions, we'd leave the tanker in Thailand and then we'd climb back up to altitude and turn around and go back in over Vietnam. Or if there were northern missions over North Korea, we'd do the same thing, make 2 passes and then come back and land. It was a good airplane to fly in weather. It was very, very stable. It's a long airplane. The pilot is sitting way out there on the pointy end. And if you get into a lot of turbulence, you kind of feel like you're on the end of a diving board. You're moving up and down, but the airplane is really very stable. So you could make instrument approaches that were a piece of cake. Anytime it was subsonic, it'd just fly like a normal airplane. It was really good. The hard part about flying the airplane was when you're up at max altitude and max speed. You had to really be careful. We had an autopilot, of course, but you had one hand on the autopilot kind of controlling. Excuse me, let me take a drink here. That one hand on the autopilot, you had a set of wheels that control your pitch. And and you'd be very, very careful on pitch control, because if you start a descent at those speeds, it'll get away from you so fast. And we have, temperature limits that we have to observe on everything. So you got to really pay attention when you're up at speed and altitude. But even then, if everything's working okay, it's still a relatively standard airplane to fly. I think we were all kind of surprised, welcomely, that it was that nice. We anticipated all sorts of wild things at Mach 3, but it turns out Mach 3 wasn't much different than Mach 1. As one of the pilots said, yeah, I've seen one Mach, you've seen them all. It wasn't quite that simple, but if you had any emergencies or anything, in the early days, we didn't quite know what the airplane was going to do sometimes with certain emergencies. So the rule was you would land at the nearest major airport. Don't, excuse me. Don't worry about getting the airplane back to Beale. That's where we'd like to have it back, because it's a son of a bitch to go out to some strange field and get it ready to return. It takes an awful lot of maintenance. But I think all of us at one time or another have landed at some other field. And then they had to come get us and fix it. Well, I guess I'm talking more than normal.
Can you,
They'd come back and, if you had major maintenance, maybe you had an engine change, they'd bring an engine in and they'd fix it, and then you'd turn around and fly it back home. I made an emergency landing up at Rapid City one time. And it's a real, real challenge to the wing commander at that base when you come in, because we call in advance, and the commanders have all been notified that if you get an SR in, here's what you got to do. It's a top secret airplane. You got to empty out one of your hangars, no matter what's in there, and put that airplane inside and put them out of sight, put guards on it. It's a real challenge. So I landed at Rapid City, and so, well, I forgot what the problem was, but the maintenance came in and fixed it. And so 2 days later, I'm leaving. And about a week later, I'm flying a similar mission, and I'm in that same general area, and I have a generator failure. And generator failures were one of the things that they had said, you should land as soon as possible. So here I am over Rapid City again. So I came in for the second time. This time the wing commander is out there to meet me, and he climbs up on the ladder. He said, okay, Major, what's her name? He assumes I got a girlfriend there now and that I'm coming back for a second trip. I assured him, no, that wasn't the case. This was a real emergency. We flew the airplane operationally for 25 years. In all of that time, we were flying out of Kadena in Japan, and for the last 20 years out of England. So we had a lot of good years. We lost a few airplanes. Nobody ever, ever bothered us with their defenses. We never had any. A lot of people shot at us. A lot of missiles were fired. Vietnam fired a ton of the SA-2 missiles, but they couldn't touch us. Combination of speed and altitude is all we need. But plus we had great defensive systems on the airplane electronically. And the guy in the back seat handled all that stuff. So he could tell when the missiles were tracking us and then when they were fired. And but they couldn't hit us. We knew they couldn't, so we didn't even worry about it.
can you see my screen, Pat?
Pardon?
Can you see my screen?
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
There's a little video here. I haven't even played it yet, but.
Oh, okay. Why don't you run it? It was a hell of an airplane. Little tail art. Yeah, I knew those guys. There's those big engines. There's Kelly. Ah, there's my U-2. Oh, those look great. Yeah, good. Yeah, the engines I mentioned, 34,000 pounds of thrust each. Now, today's engines, of course, you can make them a hell of a lot bigger than that. But that was this is one of the first engines that had that much power that put two of them in there side by side, and you really had something. They were much higher thrust ratios than most of the fighters had in those days. But that whole engine inlet geometry that made that airplane go Mach 3 was really fantastic. It was just a miracle the way those guys, between Lockheed and Pratt and Whitney, they worked together on the engine and the inlet system, because that was the secret to Mach 3. At about Mach 1.8, the engine starts converting to a ramjet. And when you're at Mach 3, the main engine is only providing about 17% of the thrust that's moving the airplane. The rest of it is a ramjet principle. You've just got air going through there and burning and compressing with the engine is just kind of along for the ride. You can't get a ramjet to work until you're up to almost Mach 2, but they devised a system where they could turn the inlet around the engine into a ramjet principle. And so the engine would actually transition. The faster you went, the faster it wanted to go. We were limited to Mach 3.2. That's what Kelly Johnson told us, that was our limit. We know the airplane would go faster, but the problem with going faster is the temperature rise is so extreme. Skin temperature back in the aft end of the airplane around the engines, the skin is almost 1,000 degrees. The temperature around the canopy, the pilot's canopy at that point, is almost 600 degrees. So the temperature is just unreal. That's why it had to be titanium. No other airplane could have done it. But it was fun to fly, and we had some fantastic equipment for the reconnaissance purposes on the airplane, both cameras and electronic and side-looking radar. Our side-looking radar could produce a picture almost as good as film. It was a very, very sophisticated stuff. So with that, we could fly night, we could fly weather. Didn't make any difference. We could pick up the intelligence regardless of what the conditions were. So, well, how about some questions? Maybe I've
got quite a few.
Yeah, shoot off.
So did you know Gary Powers?
Oh yeah. Mm-hmm.
From your U-2 days?
Yes, yeah. Uh-huh. Now he was CIA and I was Air Force. We had two programs side by side. But interestingly enough, all of the pilots in the U-2 program, both CIA and Air Force, all came out of Strategic Air Command, which you think of as bombers and missiles. But in those days, SAC, under General MAJ, he had about 6 or 7 fighter wings. We all flew F-84s. That was kind of a standard fighter. And so when CIA took over the overflight of Russia business with the U-2, LeMay said he wanted to do it with Air Force. And then, the administration said, no, you're not going to fly Air Force guys over Russia. That's an act of war. But he said, well, I want my fighter pilots to fly the U-2 in both programs. I don't want anybody in there except my F-84 pilot, because I know who they are. So all the CIA pilots were technically discharged out of the Air Force and then became CIA pilots. So we all knew each other.
So your involvement in that program, the U-2 and the SR-71, you must have met Kelly Johnson and Ben Rich.
Oh yeah. I got to know Kelly Johnson quite well. I used to go back to the factory. I was the chief standardization pilot for both programs, and I spent a lot of time back there helping the guys change the pilot's handbook, writing handbooks and stuff. So I was in and out of the factory a lot. So I got to see Kelly probably more than any of the other crews. So he knew who I was. And then when I wound up commanding the SR program near the end of my tour with the SR, I was the commander for 2 years. He always came up to Beale Air Force Base when the SRs were flying, because he was really fascinated by what he had done. And so he loved to come up, and he'd fly up in one of his Lockheed airplanes and spend a whole day with us and talk to the crews and talk to the maintenance guys. And so we became pretty close friends. When I left the program, he came to my going away party, which I was proud of.
Yeah.
And Ben Rich was the same way. He was a brilliant guy.
Did you ever play golf with Kelly?
No.
No.
I never heard him talk about golf. I didn't know he did.
I read in I forget which book it was, but he was a pretty good golfer, and he'd play with a 7-iron and a putter.
Oh shit. Well, yeah, that's good.
Yeah.
He was a little heavy most of his life, so I don't know what kind of a golfer he would be, but
Yeah.
near the end of his life, he got into pretty deep dementia. And when he left the company and Ben Rich took over the Skunk Works, at that point, they were starting to get into the 117 stealth fighter, but that was primarily Ben's program at that point. Kelly didn't really know much about that. And Ben used to tell the story that once they had it pretty well designed and looked like it was going to work, he went up to visit Kelly in the hospital, or some sort of a care center, and he sneaked a couple of pictures of the 117 along. And that's a very weird looking airplane. And he said, I showed it to Kelly, and he looked at it. He looked back at me and said, but we build pretty airplanes. What's that thing? So Kelly assured him that it was a nice airplane that flew well. But,
So one of the other questions I had is, the SR-71 had radar absorbing skin, and how good was the stealth on the SR-71?
It was quite good. The combination of stealth and the altitude and speed really was very effective. They could paint the SR. They never was quite sure. It wasn't a solid continuous paint, but they could pick up bleeps of it almost all the time. Of course, anything that was going that fast, they knew what it was. But it was really the first effort to concentrate on stealth in the building of the airplane. Kelly decided that was what he wanted to do. So in one sense, it's the first stealthy airplane we had. It wasn't as good as the 117, but it was the best thing we had for a long time.
Yeah. Another question I had related is how much knowledge did the pilots have of the surveillance package and what it was capable of?
Not much. In fact, we used to have a standing joke about the reconnaissance systems guy in the back. We said, you know, if we ever get shot down, got to bail out or something, we're captured by the enemy, I'm just going to say, well, I'm just a dumb pilot. I just fly the airplane. This guy in the back seat, he's the spy. In fact, we very seldom got to see the products. And it was the same in the U-2. We had a lot of very interesting missions in the U-2, Vietnam, and a whole bunch of other different countries. But they seldom showed those things to the pilots, to the crews. We all wanted to see that stuff, but they just come back and say, oh, yeah, you did great. This one was good. And you got 80% coverage and the rest was weather and such. But it was difficult to pry out an opportunity to see a picture.
So one of the questions, Kim Johnson just sent me a note. He asked, do you see a value in maintaining this type of capability, a manned aircraft like this? And what were your thoughts on its retirement?
Well, we hated to see it retired, and the kind of the bottom line for the Air Force, they didn't like it because it cost too damn much money, and they wanted to buy a couple of fighter squadrons instead. But they convinced Congress with the idea that we've got another one coming along. You know, that was the big story. There's another secret airplane coming along. Well, there wasn't. And then they said, well, satellites can do all this. Well, satellites are great, no question of that. And as they advance in development, they're even, you know, they got some fantastic capabilities. But the satellites, you can't move those things around just anytime you want to. Once they're up there, you got expendable fuel. And they're already up there on one mission. But if you get interested in some other part of the world and you want to take a look at it, it's going to be pretty hard to move a satellite over there to do it. And it's going to be expensive as hell in the process. And you may make that satellite move away from its primary mission to do it. And we all felt they should have kept some SRs because, you know, we could be there in a half hour. But the Air Force, it turned out to be our worst enemy. They just fought tooth and nail to get rid of it.
Yeah.
Finally convinced Congress.
No, there's been talk of another manned aircraft out there, the Aurora or whatever it is.
Yeah, the Aurora was the magic word that flashed around, and so that helped convince Congress, I guess, that there really was something else coming, but there wasn't. The Aurora was in a totally different program, but it kind of leaked out as something that would replace the SR, but that wasn't what it was for.
And I imagine the new Global Hawk and those type of aircraft must have some really good capabilities too. They're just not fast, right?
Yeah, well, the Global Hawk, as it turns out, they are now stationed at Beale Air Force Base with the U-2s, and those are the two platforms in competition. So the U-2s moved up to Beale after I left both of those programs. They eventually moved the U-2s up to Beale to be with the SR-71s. They said it makes sense to have both platforms and, you know, one headquarters take care of it. And that worked out fine. But when the SRs retired, then they moved in the Global Hawk as it was being developed. And of course, they're in competition with each other. So here's the commander, got two programs, and they're both fighting to be the survivor. The Global Hawk can't go nearly as high as the U-2. The current U-2s are just magic. They have so damn much capability. They've got stuff on board that airplane that's just unbelievable. And they carry a lot of equipment that now Global Hawk can't. They keep upgrading the U-2 and more power, more generating system. Electrical system is a big issue with both of those packages, because this sophisticated equipment they're carrying increasingly demands more and more power to be generated. The U-2 is way ahead of them. The U-2 can go higher and you get up there faster, but obviously you can't stay as long. You got a guy in the cockpit. And the Global Hawk will be 10,000 feet below him, but he can be up there for 24 hours. So it depends on what kind of a target you're looking for and what sort of defenses you're looking at.
Yeah.
But there's time and time again, there are experiences going on all the time where the pilot of the U-2 does something that only the pilot could do to either save a mission or increase the mission take by changing what's going on. So the man in the cockpit is still very important. And I think Global Hawk is probably going to disappear on us because there are more new drone type vehicles being developed. Lockheed is building another one that's supposed to be comparable to the U-2, but nobody in it. And so about every 5 years, the Congress says, well, we're going to defund the U-2. It's been up there for 60 years. But of course, the U-2 has been rebuilt about 10 times. It's like a brand new airplane.
Yeah.
And the equipment we carry is definite.
Grandfather's axe.
Hmm?
Grandfather's axe.
Yeah, grandfather's axe. Yeah, I go out to Beale occasionally we have reunions and stuff, so I've got to meet a lot of the pilots that fly it now. Now, the SR, we only had in the history of the program, we had 86 operational pilots. In the U-2, because it's been going on for 60 years, they've got something like 1,200 pilots now who have flown the U-2, including women. A number of women have flown the U-2. They've done quite well. So you go to a U-2 reunion now, and I don't know anybody. They're all young guys because I left the U-2, 50 years ago. So it's fun to go there and just talk with the young guys. They can't believe that any of us are still around that flew the A model. So yeah.
I was amazed at the angle at that U-2 would climb.
Yeah.
It was just unbelievable. It flew at Oshkosh, I don't remember, 4 or 5 years ago.
Yeah, we used to bring it up there. Yeah. Mhm.
Yeah.
We brought the SR to Oshkosh, I think, twice over the years, but the U-2 can make the spectacular climb and departure, particularly if you got a partial fuel load. You could, with the big engines they now have, they could put that thing right on its tail.
I was at Oshkosh the year, I think it was the last year the SR-71 flew over, and it was supposed to break the sound barrier, but they had a problem in that flight.
Yeah, I think, didn't they have a tanker with them when they flew over?
Yeah.
Yeah, okay, that was the CIA. We had already given them, we were in the process of giving, not CIA, but NASA, we were in the process of giving NASA a couple of SRs. They wanted to have them after we shut down. And the reason that they didn't do it, they had a malfunction. They hooked up with the tanker, and the tanker, the boom operator says, you got a hell of a fuel leak back there in such and such a location. They said, damn, we couldn't see it from the airplane. So they flew over Oshkosh, not connected. They just flew in refueling formation, but they weren't connected. As soon as they left Oshkosh, they went down, they landed at, I don't know, Mitchell Field or somewhere.
Yeah.
But that wasn't SR, but it was a NASA crew that was flying it.
So what years were you the wing commander?
I was vice commander in 72, 73, and then I was wing commander for 74 and 75.
Okay.
And when I left there, you got to keep moving in the Air Force. You got to let the young guys come in and take your jobs, like Ridge Graham. And so I said, now, where the hell am I going to go next? Well, they sent me to Guam as a checkout in a B-52. I said, you got to be shitting me. Go from the SR-71 to a B-52. And, but it was just, it was just a crew. I was a full colonel. I wasn't going to be flying on the crew force. I was vice commander of the division. So, but that was an interesting experience to fly a B-52. I got 150 hours or something, but I always had an IP with me to keep me out of the trouble.
Yeah, it was kind of an interesting airplane to watch land.
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
The spoilers and everything else. It just looked really strange. And then to take off, it kind of levitated. It didn't.
Yeah, it just came up flat. Yeah.
Yeah, it didn't rotate at all. Yeah.
The other interesting thing was the cross landing, the wheels. They could turn the wheels. So you're going this direction, but the wheels or the fuselage is aimed this way, but the runway is this way. So you line up the wheels with the runway. You got a wheel there, and you turn the wheels. Even though you're in a crosswind, you're coming down.
You could land in a crab. You could land in a crab and stay in the crab.
Yeah, you roll out in the crab. That's really a strange feeling to do that. And the other thing that bothered me on the 52, I've always been the only pilot in any airplane I've ever flown, and only with the SR to ever have anybody else in an airplane. But in 52, you got a gang of guys, and they're talking on the interphone, and they're chatting back and forth, and they're running checklists. And I told my IP, I said, God damn, how do you sort out all the conversation? He said, you just get used to it after a while. If they want to talk to you, they'll say, hey, pilot. So then you kind of perk up your ears and see what he wants to say. But all that chatter in the background going on all the time was a distraction. But, well, I've enjoyed giving you what information I can. I've skipped around a bunch of stuff, but
Does anybody else have any questions besides me?
Yeah, Pat, this is Brian Huberty.
Hey, Brian, how are you?
Good, and I apologize for throwing you in front of this crew. Here I didn't think you'd be speaking tonight, but there's a story you need to tell. And this crew got to hear from your brother Walter about 5 years ago about his drone experiences with the U.S. Army.
Yeah.
But please tell these guys about what you thought about going to visit your brother in Vietnam when he was commanding that unit there that one weekend.
Yeah, well, the time I went up forward to visit him, that was in the Korea. We were both in Korea at the same time and in Vietnam at the same time. Now, when we was in Vietnam, I was back at Daegu flying fighters, and he would come down from the front and visit me. And then we arranged it so that I could fly up north and puddle jump with some Army airplanes and go visit him at the front lines. And I told him, I says, I like my place a lot better. I got white sheets and I can go to the club at night. But that was the difference in our calling for the military. We did meet a couple of times in Vietnam. Once he stopped by when we were flying I was in Bien Hoa, Vietnam, flying U-2s, but then when I was flying the SR-71, he came down to Kadena and we met there for a while. But the strangest thing happened was when I finished, this is when I finished the U-2s before I went to the SR. I finished up my tour at Bien Hoa in Vietnam. I was getting ready to come home. And he was in country, and we had made a brief contact once, but that was about all. And we got ready to leave, and I was down at Saigon. And in the big hangar, they were processing people to get on board the airplanes that were heading back home. They were chartered airlines kind of stuff. And so I check in at the counter, this little staff sergeant gal, and I give her my name, and she says, well, that's interesting. We've got 2 Hallorans on this flight. I said, really? Yeah, his name is Walter. I said, shit, that's my brother. The odds of that coming home from Vietnam on the same airplane, that's in two different services. That was a remarkable coincidence. But yeah, I missed my brother. He passed away 2 years ago, but he was in World War II. He landed on Omaha Beach on D-Day in the first wave. He was a 19-year-old combat photographer. So he went through the whole war. in Europe, and then he decided to go back in the Army. They gave him a commission, so he became a lieutenant, and then he went to Vietnam or to Korea and then on to Vietnam. So he fought in all three wars.
Wow, it's amazing.
Yeah, I went back to Omaha Beach, but I'd never been to Omaha Beach, and I wanted to go do it. But I kept talking to him to say, we were both retired, and I said, I want to go back, but I don't want to go unless you'll go with me, because it'll be less importance unless you're there to show me around. And he didn't want to go. He'd never been back since the war. He said, I don't ever want to go back to that place. But I finally convinced him, and we did, and it was amazing as he walked me through all of the places where he had been. At St. Lo, that's where he got a Purple Heart and a Silver Star, and some other places down there. And we got all through. I said, gosh, this has been a marvelous trip, but I'm not the one that you ought to be giving this trip to. You better start taking your grandkids over here, or they'll never know anything about this war or much about you. So I'll be damned if he didn't. He made 2 more trips, bringing grandkids, bringing his wife, daughters, and grandkids. So I was really happy that he did that, because now the grandkids, got a feel for World War II, and most grandkids don't.
Yeah.
It's amazing that when I come to America here, I got a job teaching at Washburn High School, and I had probably about 8 trips into. Well, we had a lot of soldiers and airmen and etc. in Vietnam, and it's amazing. I got sick and tired of American teachers who were educated saying to me, You're telling me that Australians were in Vietnam? Wasn't it only Americans? And I nearly have a punch up. They knew nothing about any other country. New Zealanders with their artillery, and us, we had the Air Force there, we had our choppers there, we had our Caribous there,
Yeah, sure
we had our soldiers there,
You had them in Korea and Vietnam, and of course World War II.
And they'd say, yes, and they'd say, you're in Korea too? Yeah. Hello. And they'd say, well, why were you involved? And I said, well, you can thank Bob Menzies, one of our prime ministers after World War II. He said, and America saved our ass in World War II, with the Japanese.
Yeah, the Japanese.
We made a commitment there that whatever conflict America was in, we would be there with them. We would go in, no matter how small a contingent, would be there. And the only time Australians never engaged in a battle space with America was in Nicaragua. We didn't think that was whatever. And
that wasn't.
So we're all in. We're all in. America goes to war, we go with them.
Yeah.
And I couldn't believe that teachers didn't even, and I still can't find people say, what, Australians are in Vietnam? It saddens me so much.
There's a whole young generation in America that don't know anything about the rest of the world.
No. I went and looked at civics textbooks. Well, they don't teach civics in America anymore. No, even in the history textbooks, there's that much about America. Where's my fingers? That much about America in the textbooks.
Yeah.
And the rest of the world. I'm sorry, guys, but that's the reality,
I had a Vietnam question from, I actually left over from last month, and it was fascinating, both of these months we learned about history. So last month we heard a lot about the Air Force contribution in Vietnam. And from listening to that, it sounds like it was quite an effective part of that war. Last year, so I watched the Ken Burns series that was on PBS of Vietnam.
Those are great, aren't they?
Huh? Yeah, I thought it was. I learned a lot about Vietnam that I didn't know. And I, you know, as somebody who supported, you know, my dad was in the Air Force, and I certainly believe that we should have won and all that. You know, I could understand the other side of it after watching that show. But what was missing in the Ken Burns specials, he didn't say anything about air power in Vietnam. And so I wondered from, you know, when you were a pilot over there, if you saw that special, do you think that was just left out on purpose? I mean, to listen to that, you think that the Army guys fought and they just, you know, there's no way they were going to win, blah, blah, blah. And last month we heard about, well, that we bombed Hanoi, you know, and a month later they were at the peace table, and he said, well, we could have done that 2 years earlier. So, you know.
Yeah, we had about 600 POWs by then.
Yeah.
Yeah, the Navy and the Air Force, they were the bulk of the POWs. There were a few Army guys who were POWs, but for the most part, the bulk were all the guys that flying up there.
Yeah.
Yeah, the fighter business in Vietnam, I've got tons of friends that were over there. It was the most frustrating thing in the world. They had so many limitations put on them.
Yeah.
You know, you can't shoot at the enemy unless he shoots at you first.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Shit like
There
that.
was
Yeah.
so
You
much-
can't bomb Cambodia,
much-
so they bring the supply lines down through Cambodia, and you can't bomb there.
Yeah, can't do that. That's another country. Yeah.
the Russians and the Chinese were playing Johnson like a puppet, and
Oh, yeah.
they would threaten to join the war, and so he always had to back down, and he was scared to death of the Russians coming in and the
Yeah.
Chinese.
Well,
Yeah.
Johnson and McNamara, they should both go to jail for the way they ran the Vietnam War.
Yeah.
That McNamara, he was terrible.
And Johnson was so scared of killing civilians, he would
Yeah,
funnel the bomb plans to the Swedish embassy, and they would funnel the bomb plans for the next day to the North
Yeah.
Vietnamese.
that's true. That was done.
So then they'd be all ready to shoot our pilots down as we came in, and of course, a lot of the times the targets have moved.
Yeah.
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 Yeah, the fighter guys in Vietnam really had a tough time. In Korea, you know, we didn't have any SAM missiles. In Korea, it was just like World War II, except that we're flying jets instead of prop-driven airplanes. But the weapons involved were the same as World War II. Our airplanes we all had 650 caliber machine guns, and we carried napalm and bombs, and they had AAA and rifles. None of the SA-2 missiles, because the SA-2 missiles are what got most of the fighters, both Navy and Air Force in Vietnam. That missile was pretty tough to evade.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Hey, Pat, how about an airplane question? Like, what's happened with your Lancer? Is the guy who bought it from you still flying it?
The guy that bought it from me I never could figure it out. He was a big guy. I told him, I says, you know, I'm not sure I want to sell it to you. You're too big. Just get in the cockpit. And he'd scrunch down and close it. Oh, yeah, I can do it. I said, I think you're going to be unhappy. I like to sell it to some little guy about my size. No, he said, I'm going to buy the airplane and the hangar, the whole works. So I gave him a price and he gave me a check. And I said, well, okay. Well, it turns out about a year and a half later, he did a lot of work. I put in new radios and, you know, stuff like that, and new panel. And he sold it to somebody else. Somebody up in Denver's got it now. So I don't know what this guy's intent was. I think he only flew it maybe 2 or 3 times.
Yeah.
So I don't know if he wanted it as a bargaining chip for something else, but
Was that a Lancer 360?
no, it was 235.
235.
Yeah,
Okay.
it was the original kit. Yeah, it had a smaller engine. You know, guys were telling me, why don't you get to 360 or, you know, on up, get a bigger engine, go faster. I said, I've already been fast. 235 is just fine. It's a pretty little airplane. It takes me all over the United States, and that's all I needed.
Yeah, if you're not going to do Mach 3.2, why even bother going, right?
Yeah, why bother? Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. So Well, I hope you
And,
find some of the stuff interesting. I know Rich will give you a lot more detail if you ever get him back. He'll fill in all the gaps that I left with you, but
yeah, I'm sure we'll reschedule for another time.
yeah, he's good. And it's been so damn long ago since I flew the airplane. A lot of the numbers and some of the details are kind of foggy now, but I still remember it as the most exciting airplane I ever flew.
You
It just
haven't flown a PA,
had to be a hell of a view from up there.
Oh, yeah.
you haven't flown a PA-38 then?
Pardon?
You haven't flown a PA-38 then?
I got a ride in the P-38.
PA-38,
Oh,
a Piper Tomahawk.
Oh, yeah, no, I haven't.
Oh, man, you haven't lived.
That's why he's still alive.
Yeah. Well, no, Peter, I never got that. But I did get a ride in a P-30.
God, you should have looked me up when you were in Australia. I would have taken you up and we would have burnt up a bit of ground.
We could have done that. We might even have a few beers together.
Yeah.
that's
if we survive.
that's the vehicle. It's got the triangle on the back, the slow moving vehicle triangle.
you have the impacted bugs on the trailing edge.
Yeah.
Yeah. We know when the U-2s finally moved up to Beale Air Force Base to join the SR-71s in one unit, there was a lot of controversy back and forth. It goes prima donnas in both outfits. And the SR guys used to kid the U-2s because the U-2 has a big external mirror. You can see from the cockpit's off in the left side. And it's to check for contrails because you don't want to be pulling contrails depending on where you're going. And so you could always check for contrails and change your altitude, or at least when you came back and landed, you could tell the weatherman, hey, at this altitude, 55,000, I had contrails. At 58, it disappeared, and he'd make notes. But the SR guys were saying, no, the only reason they've got that is to so they can avoid being run into by birds in the rear.
Yeah.
Bird strikes in the rear.
Did you fly, Pat, did you fly the A-12s as well?
No, the CIA, that was their airplane. Yeah. I knew all those guys.
Was it A-12 basically the same airplane, or what were the differences?
It was a little smaller. It only had one guy, just a pilot, no backseater. It didn't have as sophisticated a navigation system as we did, but it didn't carry much equipment, much sensor. It had one big camera, much bigger than the one that we carried. But we carried about 6 cameras, and the technology was getting way ahead of us, and a whole bunch of other stuff. So we could carry 3 times the load that they could carry. And so it just didn't make any sense to have both systems once they realized that we had a growth potential that they didn't have. And we could gather up much more. We had a longer range. We had get more gas. We were about 5 feet longer, all full of gas. And but the airplanes had the same engines, and so our engine speed, our engine temperatures were the limiting factor on our speed. I'm trying to remember what the hell that number was now. It was a very high temperature on the engine compressor, and we had gauges to show us all that stuff. And they had the same gauge. So in effect, they were also a 3.2 airplane, just as we were, because it was the engine that limited. But they were lighter, about 7 tons lighter than we were. So they could go a little higher. They could tweak up to 90,000 at the end of the mission when they're really light. We'd peter out about 85. So they always kidded us. They called our airplane, because we had 2 people in it, that was the family model. I've heard those guys.
Soccer mom's model.
Yeah, I've heard them when they give their presentations, because people always ask them about the SR, and they say, "Oh, you mean the family model?"
Yeah.
But the guy in the back seat of the SR was really busy. He did a ton of work, and the A-12 guy by himself, he didn't have near the capability to do something, particularly on electronic intelligence and
Yeah.
his nav system. He just had to turn it on and hope it worked. Where our guy could do all sorts of stuff with the nav system, and he could run the radars. They didn't have radar systems and so.
How cramped up were you in the cockpits of the SR-71? How much
Well,
room to move about, yeah.
yeah, we've had a number of bailouts in the SR with no problem. The U-2 was very tight. I'm a little guy, and in there with the spacesuit in those days was what they called a partial pressure suit. It was a skin-tight suit with capstans running down the arms and on the back. And when you bail out, they would inflate and squeeze the suit. Just, you couldn't hardly move. But when you got in the SR, we had a full pressure spacesuit, the same suit that the Gemini astronauts wore.
Mhm.
That-
But
that's-
how much physical room
Well,
between each side, or could you have a bit of a stretch or what?
yeah, you could get much bigger guys in the SR. I felt very, very comfortable in the SR. I felt it was a roomy cockpit for my size,
Mhm.
and we had some guys that were a lot bigger than I was. But in the U-2, you had to pick kind of small guys
Mhm.
to fly it. It was a very
I
uncomfortable.
had the opportunity to fly with a lot of guys in my career with the airline that had some experience U-2 and so
Yeah,
forth. And the joke used to be, let's race to 60. The U-2 guys would say, and the SR-71s would say, let's start at 60. Is that kind of true, or just kind of a folklore?
no, that's kind of a folklore. But what they used to do is, we'll race it at 20,000 feet. Okay, but you want to do it on one engine.
Yeah.
The SR guys would say, well, no, we can't do that. But,
I think I read or heard at one of the presentations where they had to, sometimes you were an afterburner when you're refueling.
yeah.
So you're
Yeah.
basically one engine idle and the other engine, you're a feather and afterburner.
Yeah, you wouldn't pull it in idle, but you'd pull it back. Initially you're just both basic engines, and when you got temperature is too warm, or we're getting full, and the tanker can't go any faster, we have them go downhill, go into a descent so we can hang with them. And if we're having trouble staying in the boom, we'd light one afterburner and just pull the other engine back. You were kind of sideways, but that was okay. Yeah, that was a common practice if the temperatures were warm and you were getting power limited.
Oh, the other question I had, I didn't write it down, was there's a story about a signaling mission during Vietnam.
Yeah,
Flew over the Hanoi Hilton.
yeah.
What was the details on that?
They tasked us to fly 3 SR-71s over the Hanoi Hilton within 1 minute of each other, all three of them, bam, 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 because we laid down a pretty good double sonic boom. And we never knew what the reason was. It was a top secret thing. And after I had retired, I was down at Sound and Fun with the EAA air show one time, and Admiral Stockdale, he was the senior guy in the POW camp, and he was there as a casual guest and such. And I saw a little break in the people standing around him, so I introduced myself and told him I was an SR pilot. And I related the fact that we did that mission, and we never knew what it was for, but I was always amazed. And so he told me it was a signal to the prisoners. Prisoners were able to correspond outside very cleverly all the time. They were always negotiating back and forth with Washington on all sorts of things. They were managed to get stuff out, and they wanted to have an escape. One of the guys figured up this jazzy escape plan. He'd get in the river and float out to the coast, and they could pick him up. And so everybody said, no, you can't do that. And that signal was to tell the POWs that, okay, permission granted, go ahead and do it. And Stockdale said, once we got that signal, we knew that the White House had said, go ahead and try it. And they had a submarine and some surface ships out there in the Gulf, ready to move right into the river outlet and pick up in POW. But he said, I refused to let the guys do it. He said that was, the odds of doing it successfully were so remote, and what the hell was the value of it? And if you did try it, you'd get caught, and they'd come back and they'd just torture the hell out of everybody else in our camp, because they'd had escape attempts before, and the guys that were left behind really had to pay for it.
Yeah.
You know, he so Stockton said, "We ain't gonna do that again." You know, it was a nice effort, and it was interesting the way they let us know it was okay. But up until then, we never knew for sure what that was. We knew it was some kind of a signal. But
Did you fly one of those SRs in that mission, or?
No, I'd already left the program when that happened. I think I was flying B-52s over in Guam or something. But the crews that flew it, they wanted to hit over Hanoi 1 minute apart. That was the criteria. And they managed to do it. The navigation system and speed control was such that, you know, they were kind of working with each other, and they figured out how they could do it, and they're successful. They were all three 1 minute apart. And that's pretty interesting at that speed. And, you know, you don't have a lot of change available at that speed. But they managed to do it.
That must have really inspired the POWs that were there to hear that.
Yeah. Since then, I've talked to other POWs that were aware of what had happened. They had never really talked about it much before because it was something that didn't happen as far as the escape attempt. So to them, it was just a passing incident.
Yeah.
But they knew about it. But it was a strange way to pass the go-ahead word.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's so funny that I'm a little bit of a Battle of Britain history buff.
Yeah.
I read everything I can on the Battle of Britain at 144 days. But
Yeah.
it was interesting that it was a particular model Spitfire that was designed. It was unarmed, and it would fly over Germany with one camera. And when you were talking, I'm thinking back about this Spitfire, which I actually sat in at Duxford, and and the pilots would volunteer to fly over Germany unarmed with one camera. And it basically, well, apart from the First World War, but going from that to where you were in the short period of time, development of technology, you know, it was absolutely amazing, you know, absolutely amazing. And, you know, I admired those Spitfire pilots. When I think about you and what you've achieved and what you've done, it's just monumental. I'm amazed, and I'm just.
Yeah, the technology has driven us to do some marvelous things. General Russ Doherty, he was the commander, Strategic Air Command, SAC, down in Omaha for a couple of years. Very, very, very loved commander. He used to say that the two greatest advances in aviation for the military was the jet engine and in-flight refueling. Now, people don't think about in-flight refueling, but there isn't a military plane in the inventory, Navy or Air Force, that doesn't refuel.
Even rotary wing.
Yeah, the rotary wings refuel. We even modified 6 U-2s for refueling. It was a very dangerous thing to do because of speed incompatibility with the U-2 and the tanker. U-2 was so slow, and the tanker couldn't get that slow, and we couldn't get that fast. I was chief of standby at that point.
U-2 have flaps? Do the U-2 have flaps? They have flaps?
Oh, yeah.
Did the U-2 have flaps?
Yeah, we had flaps.
Speed brakes?
Flaps and speed brakes. Now, the SR didn't have any drag devices. No flaps, speed brakes, no spoilers, nothing. It was a clean airplane. It just operated on power. If you want to come down, you pull the power off. But it was impossible to make a bad landing on the SR because of ground effect. You look at the SR, the belly of it, it's like a big, flat, huge, big platform down there. And
Like a surfboard.
yeah, you'd like
What
land.
what did you come over the threshold at, you know, on a normal day, you know, normal temperatures, what,
Uh,
at sea level?
Yeah, final over the fence was 175, as I recall.
Jeez.
And the single engine was 200.
Whoa.
Yeah. But we had a big 40-foot drag chute, very, very effective.
What about the side picture out the front at that speed? You wouldn't have been able to see.
Well, in the SR, you have a very high angle of attack on
Yeah.
speeds. Yeah. Yeah, you don't see much, but you know, you're lined up before you slow down to where that nose comes up in front of you. And you can kind of see around the edges. So you feel pretty comfortable. And when you get right down on the runway, then you can see the sides. But yeah, you're a little bit blind. But we had a great anti-skid brake system. And I had the drag chute. I think this has happened 3 times. I had it happen to me once. When the drag chute came out, I was at 20,000 feet in the holding pattern.
Oh,
You were ready to make a preparation. And there was this huge bang and the airplane lurched. You know, then everything was smooth. And I thought, God, we must have hit something. So we got a little periscope in the cockpit. You can pop it up and you can look back behind the whole back of the airplane. You can see the engines and look for contrails and fire or anything back there. So I popped up the periscope and looked, and here the drag chute doors were open. Drag chute was gone because it sheared off, but there was a hell of a jolt when it opened. But I could land without the drag chute with the good speed control and anti-skid brakes. It was okay.
Yeah, Peter, your mic is a little muffled under your shirt. What's the
is it?
crosswind limitation on the SR-71?
Say again, Mike?
The crosswind limitation SR-71, because I know the U-2 has about, was it 6 knots or something like that, or 5 knot crosswind limits?
Crosswind. I don't remember what the U-2 was. U-2 was very critical because of that landing gear,
Right.
bicycle landing gear, and the huge vertical
Wing
stabilizer.
tips.
Yeah. Well, the vertical stabilizer will get you in trouble on the U-2 with the crosswind because it's big. It has to be big because up in the air is so thin. You got to have that huge, big vertical stabilizer, and the wind will give you hell on landing. The SR, we never had much trouble with the crosswind. I think they gave us a 20 knots or something, but I don't think anybody had any difficulty with the crosswind. And I think guys have landed with some really strong crosswinds, but it didn't seem to give us a problem. I guess just the silhouette of the airplane, the side angle, it didn't. And the nose gear is a long ways out in front of the main gear, so that kind of helps you. Steering.
You did a great job. Thank you.
Well, thank you, guys. I hope I didn't ramble too much. And,
oh, geez. Oh, God, no.
well, when Brian told me that Rich was coming up, and I said, oh, hell, I got to listen to that because I know Rich will give you a good briefing. But if he comes back, he'll fill in a lot more gaps for you. He's got a lot of more detail than I can recall. So,
Thank you.
okay, well, thank you, guys.
No, thank you. Thank you.
Don't freeze to death up there in that cold weather.
Oh,
Oh, it's balmy. 10 degrees.
balmy. Yeah, it's 10 degrees.
Yeah, it reminds me of my days on the farm down by Rochester. I still remember that. Yeah. Okay, guys.
Yeah, good night, mate. Thank you so much. Thank
Good
you.
night.
Great job. You bet.
Yeah, thank you.
Are we really putting in bids to shave this mop off his face?
What?
Or is that just a joke?
Oh, no, that's Norm.
Norm.
Yeah, Norm is he's found out he was related to the Duck. What is it, Duck Dynasty guy? and he's the Duck Dynasty guy's grandfather.
Duck Dynasty. You guys are too funny.
Okay.
Where are you, Norm? He can't hear us.
Are you there, Norm?
Norm doesn't have a camera.
Okay.
Microphone? Is it on mute?
There's Norm. Look at him.
There he is.
It
Duck
looks like
Dynasty. Doesn't look
like
Duck
somebody.
Dynasty- Duck Dynasty guy.
It looks like somebody's crazy uncle that comes to Christmas dinner.